The snow didn't fall. It drove sideways, feeling like ground glass against Clara's wind-chapped cheeks. Her boots, stuffed with damp newspaper, sank into the drifts outside the solitary cabin. She carried 80 extra pounds of flesh, every ounce currently aching, freezing, and pulling her toward the earth. She had come to beg for a mop, a bucket, anything to earn a meal. The door opened. Biting heat and the smell of salted pork hit her face. The mountain man didn't look at her hands. He looked at her. The mountain did not care that Clara was dying. It simply existed a brutal incline of ice-slicked rock and deep, treacherous powder. Clara stopped bracing her mittened hands against the trunk of a dead ponderosa pine. She dragged air into her lungs. It tasted metallic like pennies and blood. Below her, the mining town of Leadville was nothing but a smudge of grey wood smoke against the valley floor, a place that had systematically starved her out over the last 3 months. No one wanted a heavy-set woman to wait tables. Too slow, they said. No one wanted her for laundry. Takes up too much space in the washroom. So, she had climbed. Rumor in town spoke of a trapper up near the timberline. A man who paid silver for someone to gut his catch and scrub his floors. Her thick thighs rubbed together with every agonizing step, the heavy, wet wool of her skirts chafing the tender skin underneath. The cold was a physical weight settling deep into the dense flesh of her hips and stomach. Usually her size was a burden in the eyes of the world, a target for cruel eyes and sharp tongues. Today it was the only thing keeping her core temperature from dropping into the abyss. It was fuel, but the fuel was running out. Her toes had gone numb a mile back. Now the numbness was creeping up her calves. Move. She pushed off the pine. The wind screamed through the bare branches, a high, thin sound that vibrated in her teeth. When the cabin finally appeared, it looked less like a home and more like a growth on the side of the mountain. Rough-hewn logs packed thick with mud and moss sat squat beneath a heavy roof of snow. A thin grey ribbon of smoke twisted desperately from a stone chimney. Clara didn't feel relief. She felt a dull, thudding terror. If he turned her away, she would not survive the walk back down. She waded through the final drift, the snow dragging at her skirts like heavy, wet hands. The porch was nothing but 3 uneven planks. She stepped up. The wood groaned under her weight. She raised a fist, the knuckles cracked and bleeding from the dry cold, and hammered on the heavy plank door. Silence. Only the wind. She knocked again, harder panic finally breaking through the frozen lethargy in her brain. "Hello." Her voice cracked a pathetic croak, swallowed instantly by the gale. The heavy latch clacked. The door swung inward, and the wind immediately sucked the cabin's heat out into the storm. Standing in the frame was a man who looked like he had been carved out of the same stubborn wood as the walls. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and wearing a union suit stained with soot and grease under thick suspenders. His beard was a tangle of dark brown, threaded with premature grey, and his eyes were a pale, washed-out blue. They swept over her. He didn't flinch at her size. He didn't offer a polite, pitying smile. He just looked at the way she was shivering, the way her lips had turned a terrifying shade of blue. "What?" he said. It wasn't a question. It was a demand for efficiency. Clara swallowed. Her throat felt like sandpaper. "Work," she rasped. "I heard you need hands. I can scrub. I can skin. I can cook." She braced herself. She knew how she looked. A large woman soaked through, desperate, her face, red and mottled from the wind. She waited for the sneer. She waited for the door to shut. The man leaned against the door frame. He smelled of pine sap, old leather, and unwashed sweat. It wasn't an entirely unpleasant smell. It was just intensely alive. "I got hands," he said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated beneath the howling wind. He held them up. They were massive, calloused, scarred with old knife slips and rope burns. "I skin my own catch. I cook my own meat." Clara's chest tightened. The cynical part of her brain, the part that had kept her alive this long, screamed at her to beg. Get on your knees if you have to. I'll work for scraps. She pushed out the words tasting like ash. Just a place by the fire. You don't have to pay me silver. He stared at her. His gaze dropped to her wide hips, the heavy swell of her breasts under the damp wool, and back up to her wide, desperate eyes. It was an invasive look, but stripped of the usual mockery she received in town. It was an appraisal, like a man testing the thickness of a beam before trusting it to hold up his roof. I don't need a worker, he said slowly. Clara closed her eyes. The cold was winning. She felt her knees begin to buckle. I need a wife more than a worker. He finished. Her eyes snapped open. He stepped back, pulling the door wider. The orange glow of the hearth fire spilled over his boots. Get inside before you freeze to my porch. Mud's a bitch to clean. Clara didn't hesitate. Pride was a luxury for people with warm toes. She stepped over the threshold. The transition from the biting storm to the cabin's interior was violent. The heat hit her like a physical blow, heavy and suffocating. The air was thick with the smell of rendered animal fat, stale coffee, and burning hickory. She stood dripping on a braided rag rug. The cabin was a single large room. A cast-iron stove dominated the center, ticking loudly as the metal expanded. A massive bed covered in heavy pelts sat in the far corner. Skulls of coyotes and deer lined the rafters. It was violently masculine, untidy in a practical way, but not filthy. Take off the coat. She jumped. He had closed the door, shutting out the roar of the wind. The sudden quiet felt heavy. Clara fumbled with the wooden toggles of her coat. Her fingers were stiff, unresponsive lumps of meat. She let out a frustrated breath, struggling with a particularly stubborn loop. He walked over. He didn't ask permission. He just swatted her hands away and undid the buttons himself. His knuckles brushed against her stomach. She stiffened, sucking in a breath, trying instinctively to make herself smaller. It was a reflex. Hide the bulk. Shrink, he noticed. He didn't say anything, just pulled the heavy sodden coat from her shoulders and hung it on a peg near the fire. Sit. He pointed to a sturdy wooden chair near the stove. Clara sat. The chair creaked, but held. She spread her hands toward the iron belly of the stove. The heat felt like thousands of tiny needles stabbing into her skin as her blood began to move again. She bit her lip to keep from whimpering. He moved to a counter, pouring a dark, sludgy liquid from a tin pot into a chipped enamel mug. He brought it to her. Drink. It was coffee or something close to it. Bitter, thick, laced with chicory. It burned all the way down, leaving a trail of glorious fire in her chest. He pulled up a three-legged stool and sat opposite her. He rested his forearms on his knees, hands dangling between them. Name's Boone, he said. Clara, you heard right in town. I need help. Boone stared at the stove, watching a stray ember pop and die on the stone hearth. Winter up here is 6 months of dark. Last year the isolation near drove me to put a rifle barrel in my mouth just for something to do. He spoke of suicide with the same casual tone one might use to complain about a leak in the roof. Clara wrapped both hands around the hot mug. So you hire a maid. You don't ask a stranger to marry you. Boone looked at her. Really looked at her. Maids quit when the snow drifts hit the roofline. Maids don't have a vested interest in keeping the fire going if I break my leg on the ridge. A wife does. A business arrangement? Clara said flatly. The cynicism was back, wrapping around her like a protective shield. She was exhausted. She was hungry. She had no patience for riddles. You want a workhorse you can bed. Boone didn't flinch at her bluntness. A corner of his mouth twitched upwards, barely a smile but an acknowledgement. I want a partner, someone who ain't going to blow away in the first gale. He gestured towards her. You got meat on your bones, Clara. You got insulation. Women in town, they're like birds, fragile. The mountain eats them. You hauled yourself up a 3-mile grade in a blizzard. You didn't die. I respect that." Clara stared at the dark liquid in her mug. No one had ever spoken about her body as an asset. It had always been a moral failing, a sign of gluttony, a joke whispered behind fans. Boone spoke of her flesh like it was a finely crafted tool. It made her uncomfortable. It made her feel horribly exposed. "I don't know you," she said, her voice dropping to a defensive mutter. "I don't know you either," Boone replied. He stood up, walking over to a cast-iron Dutch oven resting on the edge of the stove. He lifted the heavy lid. The smell of rich, fatty stew filled the small space. Clara's stomach cramped so violently she gasped. Boone ladled a massive portion into a wooden bowl, dropping a hunk of hardtack biscuit on top. He handed it to her. Clara abandoned all dignity. She didn't use the spoon. She picked up the biscuit, dipped it into the thick gravy, and shoved it into her mouth. It was venison cooked down with root vegetables until it was meltingly tender. She chewed aggressively, burning her tongue, not caring. She ate like an animal. She fully expected him to look away in disgust. When she finally glanced up, a drop of gravy on her chin, Boone was just watching her. His expression was calm. Satisfied. "You stay," Boone said, his voice cutting through the ticking of the stove. "We go to the magistrate in town when the spring thaw hits. Until then, you share the work. You share the food. You share my bed." He wasn't asking. He was laying out the terms of survival. Clara scraped the last bit of stew from the bowl. She felt the heavy warmth of the food sitting in her stomach. She looked around the rough walls, listening to the wind screaming uselessly outside. Down in the valley she was a fat, invisible nuisance. Up here she was a necessity. She set the empty bowl on the floor. "I snore," Clara said, her voice rough, defensive, daring him to retract the offer. Boone stood up to take her bowl. "I'm deaf in my left ear. Sleep on that side." The transition from the table to the bed was an agonizing exercise in vulnerability. The stew sat heavy and warm in Clara's belly, a bizarre contrast to the freezing dampness of her clothes. The fire had baked the front of her skirts, leaving them stiff with dried mud, but the wool clinging to her thighs was still wet, pulling heat from her bones. "Take off the wet layers," Boone said. He didn't look up from the stove where he was scraping the cast-iron skillet with a piece of slate. "You sleep in damp wool, you wake up with fluid in your lungs. I ain't nursing pneumonia." Clara swallowed. The cabin was a single room. There were no screens, no changing closets. Just the heavy silence of the mountain and the rhythmic scraping of stone on iron. "Turn around," she demanded. Her voice shook, though, whether from the lingering cold or the sudden spike of fear she couldn't tell. Boone scraped the pan once more, tapped the slate against the rim, and set it down. He turned his back to her, facing the blank, mud-chinked wall. He didn't sigh. He didn't make a show of his patience. He just stood there, still as a felled tree. Clara moved quickly. Her stiff, bruised fingers struggled with the laces of her boots. She groaned softly as she pulled them off her swollen feet, throbbing as the blood rushed back into the constricted tissue. She peeled off the heavy, sodden skirts and the damp underskirts, leaving them in a heap on the hearthstones. She stood in her thick cotton chemise and bloomers. They were dry, but she felt entirely exposed. She wrapped her arms around her thick waist, suddenly hyper-aware of the space she took up. The roll of her stomach, the heavy weight of her breasts, the wide expanse of her hips. In town, she covered herself in layers, hiding the bulk beneath aprons and shawls. Here the firelight threw a massive, unignorable shadow against the far wall. "I'm decent," she muttered, hurrying toward the bed in the corner. Boone turned. He picked up her wet clothes, shook them out, and draped them carefully over a wooden drying rack near the stove. Then he unhooked his suspenders. Clara scrambled beneath the heavy pile of furs on the bed. The mattress was stuffed with pine needles and dried grass. It crunched loudly under her weight. The furs smelled violently of musk, old dirt, and animal oil. They were incredibly heavy, pinning her down like a layer of earth. Boone stripped down to his thermal union suit. He walked to the lantern, hanging from the central beam, blew out the flame, and plunged the cabin into darkness. Only the orange bleed from the stove's draft door provided any light. The bed groaned as he climbed in. He didn't try to touch her. He didn't offer a reassuring word. He stayed on his edge, facing away from her. Left ear. He reminded her, his voice rough with exhaustion. Like I said, Clara lay rigid. She was exhausted to her marrow, but sleep was a distant, impossible concept. The wind hammered against the roof, sounding like a physical assault. The log walls popped and cracked as the temperature dropped outside. She listened to Boone's breathing. It was deep, rhythmic, and completely untroubled. He was asleep within minutes. She wasn't safe. She was trapped in a box on the side of a lethal mountain with a stranger. Yet as the hours crawled by, the heat radiating from Boone's back began to seep through the dense furs. It was a furnace. Her toes, still aching, finally began to thaw completely. She pressed her back against the mattress, feeling the sharp poke of a pine twig through the ticking, and let her eyes close. It wasn't comfort. It was survival. When she woke, the cabin was freezing. The fire had died down to glowing coals. Boone was already up-dressed and pulling on heavy leather gloves. The smell of old coffee hung in the air. "Daylight's burning," he said, noticing her open eyes. "Though you can't see the sun through the squall. Get up." Clara groaned. Every muscle in her body screamed in protest as she shifted. Her legs felt like lead pipes. The sheer effort of hauling her 80 extra pounds upright sent a jolt of pain through her lower back. She threw off the heavy pelts. The frigid air bit into her skin instantly. She scrambled into her clothes, which were stiff and rough from drying too close to the heat. They smelled like wet dog and wood smoke. Boone pointed to a wooden bucket near the door. "Water's frozen in the barrel outside. Take the hatchet, break the ice, fill the bucket, bring it in, then clean the ash from the stove trap. Breakfast is hardtack and lard until you render the fat from the deer I shot Tuesday." He didn't wait for her to agree. He pulled his hat down low and walked out the door, letting a swirl of snow blow inside before pulling it shut. Clara stared at the closed door. The cynical voice in her head laughed. "A wife. Right. You're a pack mule." She picked up the hatchet. Its handle was polished smooth from years of sweat and friction. She stepped out onto the porch. The cold punched her in the chest, stealing her breath. The snow was knee-deep. She waded to the rain barrel, her thighs burning with the effort. She raised the hatchet and brought it down on the thick layer of ice. The shock traveled up her arm, jarring her shoulder. She hit it again and again. Her breath plumed in the grey air. Sweat prickled at her hairline, freezing almost instantly against her skin. She didn't stop until the ice shattered. She plunged the bucket into the freezing water, the icy liquid splashing over her wrists, burning like fire. She hauled it out. It was incredibly heavy. Her shoulders strained the thick muscle beneath her fat, working hard. She dragged it back to the porch, her boots slipping on the icy wood. She slammed the door shut behind her, gasping, her lungs burning. She looked at the bucket of water. She had done it. It was miserable, painful, freezing work. But as she walked over to the stove to start pulling the hot ash, she realized something. Boone hadn't stood over her to watch if she could do it. He hadn't offered to help because he assumed she was too fat and slow to manage. He had simply expected her to work. It was a brutal kind of respect. And God help her, she was going to earn it. By the second week, the cabin stopped feeling like a temporary shelter and began to feel like a cage. The blizzard had finally broken, leaving behind a sky the color of a bruised plum and snowdrifts that buried the bottom half of the windows. The silence outside was absolute, pressing against the log walls with a physical weight. Inside, the noise was relentless. Clara stood at the heavy wooden table, a butchering knife gripped tight in her right hand. Before her lay the partially processed carcass of a mule deer Boone had dragged out of the snowbank that morning. The smell was overpowering, a metallic, musky stench of blood-raw meat and ruptured intestines. "You're cutting too deep." Boone's voice rumbled from the corner where he was oiling a rifle mechanism. "You're taking the meat with the silver skin. Wasteful." Clara gritted her teeth. Her hands were slick with grease and blood. The knuckles on her right hand were swollen and red, the skin split from the constant cold and wet. "The knife is dull." She snapped back, not looking at him. "Knife's fine. Your angle's wrong." Boone set the rifle down. He walked over his heavy boots, thudding against the floorboards. He stepped up behind her. He didn't crowd her, but his sheer size blocked out the light from the lantern. He reached around his calloused hand, closing over hers on the knife handle. Clara froze. The sudden proximity was jarring. She could smell the pine pitch on his shirt, the stale sweat on his skin. His chest brushed against her back, and she reflexively sucked her stomach in a pathetic attempt to minimize her width. "Stop pulling away." He muttered, his breath warm against her ear. "Plant your feet. Use your weight." He guided her hand. He didn't treat her gently. He adjusted her grip with firm, rough pressure, forcing the blade flat against the muscle. "Don't saw it. Push. Let the edge do the work. You got the mass behind you to drive it. Use it." He stepped back, immediately retreating to his corner, as if touching her burned. Clara stared at the meat. "You got the mass behind you." Again with the blunt, unvarnished truth of her body. She took a breath, smelling the copper tang of the deer. She widened her stance, planting her thick legs firmly on the uneven floorboards. She adjusted the knife, leaned her weight into her shoulder, and pushed. The blade slid cleanly through the connective tissue, separating a perfect sheet of silver skin from the dark, red venison beneath. She let out a short, harsh breath. It worked. "Better." Boone grunted from the corner. They worked in silence for the next 2 hours. Clara's back ached a dull, rhythmic throb. Her feet throbbed in her damp boots. She cut the meat into strips, tossing them into a wooden bowl for smoking, and scraped the thick white fat into a cast-iron pot for rendering. It was vile work. Her fingernails were caked with dark blood. Her apron was ruined. But there was a strange, hypnotic rhythm to it. Down in Leadville she had scrubbed floors for women who looked at her with polite disgust, who paid her pennies to make their dirt disappear. Here the dirt was the point. The blood was life. She was taking apart an animal to ensure they wouldn't starve when January hit. There was no pretense here. "Pot's full!" Clara said, her voice rough. She wiped her forehead with the back of a bloody wrist, leaving a red smear across her pale skin. Boone looked up. "Put it on the stove. Slow heat. Don't let it scorch or the lard will taste like ash." Clara grabbed the iron handles of the pot. It was massive, easily weighing 40 pounds, filled with dense animal fat. She bent her knees, engaged her core, and lifted. Her heavy thighs pushed upward, the thick muscle driving the weight. She hauled the pot across the room and hauled it onto the black iron stovetop. She didn't drop it. She didn't ask for help. She turned around, wiping her hands on a scrap of burlap. Boone was watching her. He wasn't looking at her face. He was looking at her arms where the sleeves of her dress were rolled up, exposing the thick, pale flesh and the solid muscle beneath. He looked at the way she stood, feet planted, breathing hard, but not broken. "Town folks are fools," Boone said quietly. It was the longest sentence he had spoken unprompted in 3 days. Clara frowned, defensive instantly. "Excuse me. They see a heavy woman. They think slow. They think lazy." Boone picked up his rag and went back to oiling his rifle. "They don't see the engine. You move that pot like it's a teacup. You haul water without complaining. You complain about the knife, but you don't quit the meat." Clara felt a sudden bizarre heat rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the stove. She crossed her arms over her chest, suddenly feeling terribly awkward. She was used to insults. She knew how to deflect cruelty. She had no armor against whatever this was. I'm surviving, she said flatly. We're surviving, Boone corrected. He slammed the bolt of the rifle forward with a sharp metallic clack. Render the fat. Tomorrow I'll teach you how to shoot. I'm not leaving you alone in this cabin without knowing how to blow a hole through a mountain lion. Clara looked at the pot of melting fat, the clear liquid bubbling up around the white chunks. A strange, tight knot in her chest, one she hadn't realized she'd been carrying since she climbed the mountain, loosened just a fraction. She was here. She was useful. And she was going to learn how to shoot. The cold the next morning wasn't just a temperature, it was an act of violence. When Boone pushed the cabin door open, the glare off the snowbank hit Clara's eyes like a physical strike. She squinted, her vision watering instantly. The air she pulled into her lungs was so frigid it tasted like crushed mint and iron. Boone stepped onto the porch carrying a Winchester lever-action rifle. The wood of the stock was scarred and darkened with years of sweat and gun oil. The steel barrel looked deadly cold. Step down, Boone ordered. Clara lumbered off the porch, her boots sinking halfway to her knees in the packed powder. She wore Boone's spare coat over her own. It was massive, swallowing her frame, smelling of wood smoke and trapped stale sweat. Boone waded out a few paces and jammed a thick dead branch into the snowbank. He walked back, handed her the rifle, and stepped away. Clara nearly dropped it. It was shockingly heavy, a solid, brutal piece of machinery. The cold metal instantly sucked the heat from her bare fingertips through the thin cotton liners she wore inside her leather mittens. "Don't hold it like a broom handle," Boone said. He stepped behind her. He didn't wrap his arms around her waist like a dime novel hero. He kicked the inside of her left boot with his toe. "Widen your stance. Shoulder width. Give yourself a base." Clara shifted her thick legs, sinking deeper into the snow to find purchase. "Lift it." She brought the rifle up to her shoulder. Her arms trembled under the weight. "Tuck the stock into the meat of your shoulder, right there." He tapped a hard finger against the thick padding of muscle and fat near her collarbone. "Pull it tight. If you leave a gap, the kick will break your collarbone. You hold it tight, it just pushes you back." Clara yanked the heavy weapon hard against her shoulder. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She had never held a gun. In town, guns were for drunken miners settling gambling debts or sheriffs breaking up riots. They were loud, chaotic things. "Look down the barrel. See the front sight. Put it in the groove of the rear sight. Put the tip of the front sight on the branch." She closed her left eye. The metal barrel wavered. She was breathing too fast, small clouds of vapor obscuring her vision. "Stop panting," Boone rumbled. "Breathe in. Let half of it out. Hold it. Squeeze the trigger. Don't jerk it. Squeeze." Clara inhaled the sharp, freezing air. She let out a short puff. She held her breath. Her finger, stiff and clumsy, curled around the cold crescent of the trigger. She squeezed. The explosion shattered the dead silence of the mountain. It was deafening. The rifle bucked backward with terrifying force. The steel butt slammed into Clara's shoulder like a mule's kick. The noise rattled in her teeth. But she didn't fall. She stumbled half a step backward, her heavy boots dragging through the snow. Her wide stance and her sheer physical mass absorbed the shockwave. Where a smaller woman would have been knocked flat on her back, Clara merely swayed and righted herself. A thick cloud of white smoke drifted back into her face, stinging her eyes and filling her nose with the sharp, acrid stench of sulfur and burnt powder. "Missed," Boone said flatly. Clara lowered the rifle, her ears ringing a high, thin pitch. She looked at the dead branch. It was untouched. She looked down at the gun in her hands. Her shoulder throbbed a deep, hot ache. But beneath the pain, a sudden, fierce spark caught in her chest. She hadn't fallen. She levered the action. The metal clacked smoothly, ejecting a smoking brass casing into the snow with a soft hiss. "Again," she said, her voice sounding muffled through the ringing in her ears. Boone's eyebrows lifted just a fraction. He stepped back, crossing his thick arms over his chest. "Find your base." Clara planted her feet again. She dug her heels into the packed snow. She lifted the rifle. It felt slightly less alien this time. She wedged the stock firmly into the heavy flesh of her shoulder, letting her body become a shock absorber. She lined up the sights. She controlled her breathing, fighting the instinct to flinch. She squeezed. The gun roared. The recoil punched her. She grunted, but her feet stayed planted. 50 yards away, the dead branch splintered violently, the top half snapping off and vanishing into the drift. Clara lowered the gun. She was breathing hard now, the sulfur burning the back of her throat. She looked at the shattered wood, then turned to Boone. He didn't smile. He didn't offer a round of applause. He just gave a short, single nod. Good. Now you know how it feels. He walked past her, pulling the branch out of the snow and tossing it aside. Keep the rifle loaded by the door. If a cat comes sniffing around the meat shed while I'm on the trap line, you don't aim for the head. It's too small. You aim for the center of mass. You put a hole in its engine. Clara watched him walk back to the porch. Her shoulder was beginning to bruise, a deep purple stain she knew would spread across her skin by nightfall. She smelled like gunpowder and sweat. She held the rifle by her side, no longer terrified of its weight. Aim for the center of mass. For the first time in her life, she felt something resembling power. She followed him back inside. By late January, the cabin had shrunk. The walls seemed to press inward, thick with the smell of wet wool wood ash and unwashed bodies. They had been snowed in for 8 straight days, a relentless whiteout that made it impossible for Boone to check his traps. They existed in a suffocating bubble of heat and silence, broken only by the crack of the stove and the whistling draft under the door. Clara was losing her mind. Her skin crawled. The heavy layers of clothing she wore day and night were stiff with dried sweat and cooking grease. She felt entirely disgusting, a heavy, filthy lump occupying too much space in the tiny room. Boone was outside shoveling a path to the woodpile. The rhythmic scrape of his iron shovel against the ice was a metronome, counting down Clara's fractured patience. She dragged the large tin wash basin from under the bed. She filled it with buckets of snow, hauling them in one by one, gasping with the exertion, and set the basin squarely on the flat top of the cast-iron stove. She was going to wash, or she was going to walk out into the blizzard and freeze. Those felt like her only 2 options. It took an agonizing hour for the snow to melt and heat to a steaming simmer. Clara dragged the heavy basin to the center of the room, splashing water onto the floorboards. She grabbed a sliver of harsh yellow lye soap and a scrap of coarse flannel. She hesitated, glancing at the thick wooden door. The latch was dropped, but it offered no real privacy. Boone could walk in at any second. Let him. She thought a sudden surge of cynical exhaustion washing over her. He bought a wife, not a mystery. She stripped. She peeled off the heavy wool sweater, the stiff blouse, the damp chemise. The cold air of the cabin instantly raised goosebumps across her pale, thick skin. She stood naked in the center of the room, shivering violently. She dipped the rag into the hot water, lathered the harsh soap, and scrubbed. She scrubbed at the grease on her forearms, the soot on her neck, the sweat trapped in the deep folds of her stomach, and beneath her heavy breasts. The water turned a murky grayish-brown almost instantly. Her skin turned a raw, slapped pink. She was just dragging the soapy rag down her thick thigh when the heavy iron latch on the door clacked loudly. Clara froze. Panic, hot and sharp, spiked in her chest. She grabbed a thin woven blanket off the foot of the bed and yanked it up under her armpits, clutching it tight against her chest. The door swung open. A violent gust of snow and wind blew inside, followed by Boone. He kicked the door shut behind him, stamping his boots to knock off the snow. He turned around to pull off his gloves. He stopped. The cabin was dead silent, save for the hissing of the water droplets that had splashed onto the hot stove. Boone stood by the door. His pale blue eyes locked onto Clara. She was pressed against the side of the bed, her wet hair plastered to her skull, clutching the meager blanket. Her massive pale shoulders were exposed. A deep, ugly, yellowish-purple bruise marred her right collarbone, the lingering kiss of the Winchester. Clara couldn't breathe. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. The cynical armor she wore so well shattered under the heavy, silent weight of his stare. She felt every ounce of her fat, every stretch mark, every flaw. She waited for him to avert his eyes. She waited for the look of disgust, the uncomfortable clearing of his throat. Boone didn't look away. He pulled his gloves off slowly, dropping them onto the table. He unbuttoned his heavy coat, shrugging it off and hanging it on a peg. He didn't say, "Excuse me." He didn't turn his back. He walked slowly toward the center of the room. Clara shrank back, her knuckles turning white as she gripped the blanket. "Boone," she warned, her voice, a reedy, pathetic whisper. He stopped just out of arm's reach. The smell of the freezing storm clung to him, a sharp contrast to the humid, soapy heat rising from the basin. He looked at the dirty water. He looked at the harsh lye soap. Then his eyes moved up to her bare right shoulder. He reached out. Clara flinched hard, closing her eyes tightly, bracing herself. His fingers were freezing cold. They brushed against the swollen, yellowing skin of the bruise. His touch was incredibly light, a jarring contrast to the massive, calloused size of his hand. "You're flinching before you shoot," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "That's why it bruises. You have to let the gun settle into the meat, Clara. Stop fighting the kick." Clara opened her eyes. He was staring at the bruise, not her chest, not her stomach. "It hurts!" She rasped, the admission slipping out before she could stop it. Boone dropped his hand. "Survival hurts," he replied bluntly. He looked at her face. Her eyes were wide, terrified and defiant, all at once. "You're washing." "I was. Water's getting cold." He turned away from her, walking toward the stove. He picked up the heavy iron kettle which had been boiling quietly on the back burner. He carried it over to her basin. "Move your legs." Clara hesitated, then shuffled backward, dragging the blanket with her. Boone poured the boiling water into the murky basin, warming the bath back up. Steam plumed into the cold air. He set the kettle down. "Finish," he said, not looking at her. He walked to his chair in the corner, sat down, and picked up a piece of harness leather and an awl. He began to punch holes in the thick hide, the rhythmic thwack-thwack filling the silence. He didn't leave the room. He didn't turn his chair around, but he kept his eyes locked firmly on the leather in his hands. Clara stood shivering by the steaming basin. Her chest heaved with a bizarre mix of adrenaline and confusion. He hadn't shamed her. He hadn't leered. He had just acknowledged her, accepted the reality of her body in his space without demanding anything from it. Slowly, her hands trembling, she let the blanket drop back to the floor. She picked up the rag, dipped it in the hot water, and began to wash the soap from her skin. The scrape of the awl continued in the corner, steady, unbothered, and strangely grounding. For the first time since climbing the mountain, Clara didn't feel like a heavy burden. She just felt like a woman getting clean. February brought the false spring, a cruel trick of the mountain that melted the top layer of snow during the day and froze it into a lethal sheet of slick ice by night. Boone didn't come back when the sun dipped behind the jagged western ridge. Clara stood by the window, rubbing a patch of frost from the glass with her thumb. The cabin was warm, smelling of roasted root vegetables and rendering tallow, but the quiet was entirely wrong. Usually Boone's heavy rhythmic tread on the porch signaled the end of the day. Tonight there was only the wind whining through the chinking. Panic was a cold, slippery thing in her gut. If he died out there, she died in here. She knew how to shoot now, how to butcher, but she couldn't navigate the trap lines or pack out enough meat to survive the rest of the winter alone. It was nearly midnight when the door slammed open. Boone didn't walk in. He fell. He crashed onto the floorboards, dragging a rusted steel trap clamped viciously onto his own left calf. The heavy door swung wildly in the wind, blowing a flurry of snow over his prone body. Clara dropped the iron poker she had been clutching. She rushed forward, throwing her entire weight against the door to force it shut against the gale. She dropped the latch and spun around. Boone was trying to push himself up, his breath tearing out of his lungs in wet, ragged gasps. The smell hit her immediately fresh blood copper and dark mixed with the musky stink of panicked sweat. Boone! Clara fell to her knees beside him. He didn't look at her. His face was a greyish white, his teeth bared in an animalistic grimace. His heavy canvas trousers were shredded below the knee, soaked in a dark, spreading stain. "Spring broke." He gasped out his head, falling back against the planks. "Stepped blind. Goddamn jaws snapped." Clara stared at the trap. It was designed for a bear, a monstrous contraption of rusted iron teeth meant to crush bone. It had chewed through the thick canvas and the leather of his boot, sinking deep into the dense muscle of his leg. "I need to get it off," Clara said. Her voice shook, but she forced her hands to remain steady. "Lever." Boone grunted, his eyes squeezed shut. "Side, you gotta push the springs down, both at once, heavy." Clara crawled toward his boots. The iron was freezing slick with his blood. She placed her hands on the heavy metal springs on either side of the jaws. She pushed. They didn't budge. The mechanism was stiff with rust and frost. "I can't." She panicked, her wet fingers slipping. Boone's hand shot out, grabbing her wrist with terrifying strength. His eyes snapped open, wild and fever-bright. "You have to. If it stays, stops the blood. Lose the leg." Clara looked at his leg, then at the massive springs. Her arms weren't strong enough, but her arms weren't her only asset. She scrambled up, stepping directly over his injured leg. "Don't move," she ordered. She placed the heavy heel of her right boot squarely on the left spring. She placed her left boot on the right spring. She looked down at him, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was 80 pounds overweight, 80 pounds of excess of shame, of useless bulk that the town of Leadville had despised. She grabbed the heavy timber of the table to steady herself, took a breath, and picked her feet up, dropping her entire massive body weight down onto the rusted springs. The iron groaned. Boone screamed, a raw, tearing sound that vibrated in the floorboards as the rusted teeth scraped against his tibia. But the jaws opened. Clara kicked the trap away instantly, dropping back to the floor. Blood surged from the mangled flesh, a horrifying pulse of dark red. "Bandages." Boone choked out, clutching his thigh to slow the femoral artery. "Stove, burn it." The next 3 hours were a blurred nightmare of butchery. Clara didn't think. She just moved. She tore her petticoats into strips. She heated his hunting knife in the glowing coals of the stove until the steel glowed orange. She had to straddle him to keep him still, pinning his hips to the floor with her heavy thighs, while she pressed the searing blade against the bleeding meat. The smell of burning human flesh was unspeakably foul, a sickly sweet char that made her gag violently into the collar of her dress. Boone passed out on the second press. For 3 days the fever raged. Boone lay in the bed, thrashing under the heavy furs. The cabin smelled of sickness, sour sweat lye soap, and the sharp tang of cheap whiskey Clara used to clean the wound. She didn't sleep. She sat in the wooden chair beside the bed, a bucket of snow at her feet, constantly wringing out cold rags and pressing them to his burning forehead. When the delirium took him, he was violent. He threw punches at invisible ghosts, shouting about cave-ins and black, damp memories of a mining life he had clearly fled. Because of her size, Clara was the only thing that kept him in the bed. When he tried to violently roll out, she simply leaned her weight over his chest, using her mass as a heavy, unyielding blanket. She pinned his wrists, her thick arms trembling with exhaustion, whispering rough, meaningless words until the fever broke his strength, and he went limp again. On the 4th morning, the smell of the cabin changed. The sourness broke. Clara was slumped in the chair, her chin resting on her chest, dead asleep. A dry, rough hand brushed her knee. She jerked awake, gasping. Boone was looking at her. His eyes were sunken, ringed with bruised purple shadows, but the glassy, wild heat was gone. He looked at the bloody rags in the corner, at the emptied whiskey bottle, and finally at Clara. Her hair was a matted bird's nest. Her dress was stiff with his dried blood. He didn't say thank you. He didn't offer a dramatic confession of gratitude. He slowly reached out his weak fingers, wrapping loosely around her thick wrist. His thumb brushed over the raw, split skin of her knuckles. "You didn't run," he whispered, his voice cracking like dry wood. Clara stared at his hand on her wrist. The cynical armor tried to rise, tried to tell her he was just glad his property hadn't abandoned him. But the armor cracked. She was too tired to lie to herself. "Where would I go, Boone?" She rasped her throat tight. "I need a fire." Boone closed his eyes, his thumb still resting against her pulse. "Fire's yours, Clara, long as you want it." By the time the deep thaw finally reached the timberline in late April, Boone walked with a heavy, permanent limp, dragging his left boot slightly with every step. But he walked. The mountain wept. Water dripped from the rooflines, creating deep, muddy trenches around the cabin. The air smelled of wet pine needles, thawing earth, and raw, aggressive life. They loaded the pack mule in silence. They were going to Leadville. The magistrate was waiting. Clara wore her best dress, though it hung differently now. The brutal labor of the winter, the hauling of water, the butchering, the frantic nursing, it hadn't made her thin. She was still a massive woman. But the softness had hardened. The fat was now interlaced with dense, functional muscle. She moved with a heavy, deliberate grace, grounded and sure of her footprint. The descent was agonizing. The mud was a thick, sucking slop that tried to pull her boots from her feet. Boone rode the mule. His leg couldn't handle the strain of the downhill grade. Clara walked beside him, leading the animal by the halter. When the smudge of Leadville finally materialized through the pines, Clara's chest tightened. The town was a chaotic scar on the valley. It smelled of sulfur-cheap beer horse manure and unwashed humanity. As they walked down the main thoroughfare, the noise was a physical assault after 6 months of absolute silence. Pianos banged off key in the saloons. Wagons clattered, men shouted, and people stared. Clara felt the heat rise in her cheeks. She recognized the mercantile owner sweeping his porch. She recognized the laundry women carrying baskets across the muddy street. She saw their eyes widen. She saw the whispers behind chapped hands. She lived. The trapper actually kept the fat cow. She shrank instinctively, her shoulders rolling forward, trying to minimize her width. She let the mule's halter go slack, falling half a step behind Boone. Boone stopped the mule. He didn't look at the staring townsfolk. He looked down at Clara. He saw the slump of her shoulders, the sudden, terrified vulnerability in her eyes that hadn't been there when she was facing down a blizzard or searing his flesh with hot iron. "Clara!" he barked. She looked up, startled. "Pick up the lead," Boone said, his voice carrying over the muddy street. "Stand up straight. You survived the timberline. They just survived the barroom." He reached down from the saddle, offering his large, scarred hand. Clara looked at his hand. She looked at the smirking mercantile owner. She took a breath, smelling the foul air of the town, and realized she missed the clean, vicious cold of their mountain. She didn't belong down here anymore. She belonged to the wood smoke and the rendering fat. She grabbed Boone's hand. He didn't pull her up to the saddle, but the grip was a solid, undeniable tether. She straightened her spine, pulling her heavy shoulders back, and took the mule's lead. She walked forward, not beside him, but leading him through the mud. The magistrate's office was a cramped, dusty room above the assay office. The man behind the desk was thin, balding, and smelled of stale tobacco and dismissive authority. He looked at the marriage license Boone slid across the desk, then looked at Clara, his lip curling slightly in a barely concealed sneer. "Well, Mr. Boone," the magistrate drawled, dipping his pen in the inkwell. "Looks like you survived the winter. Found yourself a sturdy housekeep, did you? Most men just buy a dog to keep the cabin warm." Clara's jaw clamped shut. The humiliation burned hot and familiar in her throat. She stared at the dusty floorboards. Boone didn't shout. He didn't slam his fist on the desk. He leaned his heavy frame forward, planting both calloused hands flat on the magistrate's papers. "I broke my leg in a bear trap in February." Boone said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly quiet, gravelly rumble. "I weighed 210 pounds. She dragged me inside. She broke the jaws of the trap. She held me down and burned the rot out of my leg. She hauled the water, she chopped the wood, and she kept the fire lit in a blizzard that would have buried you in your sleep." The magistrate froze the pen hovering over the inkwell. The sneer completely vanished from his face. Boone turned his head, his pale blue eyes locking onto Clara. There was no romance in his gaze, no flowery adoration. It was something infinitely heavier. It was absolute, unshakable respect. "She ain't a housekeep," Boone said softly, never breaking eye contact with her. "She's my partner. She pulled my weight. Now sign the damn paper." Clara stood in the dusty office, the thick wool of her dress suffocating in the spring heat, and felt a strange, alien sensation bloom in her chest. It wasn't just survival anymore. She looked at the man with the ruined leg and the scarred hands and realized the wild, cynical bargain they had struck in the freezing dark had accidentally forged a marriage of iron. She didn't need to be small. She just needed to be strong enough to hold the line. And she was. The ride out of Leadville was different than the walk in. The oppressive weight of the town's stairs had shattered the moment the ink dried on the magistrate's paper. Clara carried the folded document in the deep pocket of her skirts. It felt no heavier than a dried leaf, yet it tethered her to the mountain, to the cabin, and to the crippled man riding the mule beside her. They had spent his hard-earned silver at the mercantile, not on ribbons or lace, but on 50 pounds of salt, a heavy sack of real coffee beans, tins of peaches, and a brand-new razor-sharp butchering knife with a bone handle. Practical things, survival things. But as Clara had loaded the packs, Boone had quietly dropped a small, paper-wrapped block of lavender soap into her hands. He hadn't said a word. He just turned and adjusted the saddle girth. Clara had held the fragrant square, the floral scent entirely alien amidst the stink of raw canvas and cured tobacco. It was an offering, a luxury, an acknowledgement that they were no longer just fighting off the grave. They were setting up a life. The ascent was brutal. The spring melt had turned the mountain trail into a treacherous sluice of grey mud and loose scree. Without the packing of the winter snow, the jagged rocks lay exposed. The mule struggled its hooves, slipping on the wet stones, blowing hard through its wide nostrils. By the time they reached the halfway point, a flat outcropping overlooking the valley, Boone's face was the color of old ash. The constant jolting motion of the saddle was tearing at the freshly healed muscle in his leg. He didn't complain, but Clara heard the ragged edge to his breathing. "Stop!" Clara ordered. She didn't wait for his permission. She grabbed the mule's bridle, hauling the beast to a halt. The air was thin up here, smelling of crushed pine needles and wet granite. The sun was hot on her shoulders, baking the damp wool of her dress. Boone gripped the saddle horn, his knuckles stark white. He looked down at her, a muscle jumping in his jaw. Pride was a stubborn thing harder to kill than a starved coyote. "I can ride," he ground out. "You can bleed out in the mud too, but I'd rather you didn't." Clara shot back her tone, flat, unbothered by his glare. "Get down. Walk the flat part. Let the blood circulate. You're riding too stiff." He stared at her. A month ago, she would have never dared command him. She would have kept her head down and let him suffer for his own stubbornness. But she was the one who had burned the rot from his flesh. She owned a piece of that leg now. Slowly, Boone swung his good leg over the saddle. When his ruined left boot hit the muddy earth, his knee buckled. Clara moved instantly. She stepped in close, her heavy, solid frame catching him before he hit the dirt. She didn't flinch under his massive weight. She simply planted her boots wide, her thick thighs bracing against the sudden strain, and hooked her arm tight around his waist. For a long moment they stood locked together on the precipice. He was leaning heavily against her, breathing hard, his face buried in the crook of her neck. He smelled of horse-sweat leather and pain. Clara wrapped her other arm around his broad chest, holding him steady. She wasn't a delicate flower collapsing under a man's embrace. She was a load-bearing pillar. She felt the heavy, thudding rhythm of his heart against her collarbone. "I got you," she muttered into the rough wool of his coat. Boone let out a long, shaky breath. He turned his head, his rough beard scratching against her jaw. He didn't pull away. "I know." They walked the next mile like that, three-legged, tethered together, a slow, agonizing crawl through the mud. Every time he stumbled, her mass caught him. The town had seen her weight as a deformity. Up here, it was the gravity that kept them both from falling off the edge of the world. When the cabin finally came into view, it looked different. The menacing, snow-buried bunker of January was gone. In its place stood a sturdy, rough-hewn home, surrounded by blooming fireweed and the rushing roar of a swollen creek. It was dusk by the time they unpacked the mule. Clara built a fire in the stove, the familiar pop and crack of the dry hickory settling her frayed nerves. She unrolled the paper of lavender soap and placed it carefully on a saucer near the wash basin. They ate in silence tinned peaches and hardtack, exhausted to their marrow. When it was time for bed, the dynamic shifted. The freezing desperation of winter was gone. The heavy, stifling furs had been packed away in a cedar chest, replaced by a softer patchwork quilt. The cabin wasn't plunging below freezing. It was comfortably warm. Clara stood by the stove. The dim orange light painted the heavy curves of her hips and the thick slope of her shoulders. She unbuttoned the front of her damp, muddy dress. She felt the familiar old spike of anxiety, the urge to hide, to shrink, to turn off the lantern. She looked over her shoulder. Boone was sitting on the edge of the bed in his thermal shirt, rubbing the scarred, twisted flesh of his left leg. He stopped massaging his calf and looked up at her. He didn't demand she hurry up. He didn't turn to face the wall. He watched her. Clara took a slow breath, letting the dress pool at her feet. She stood in her cotton chemise, a large, deeply imperfect woman, marked by a brutal winter. She didn't cover her stomach. She didn't cross her arms. She forced herself to stand tall, letting the firelight reveal every ounce of the body that had kept them alive. Boone stood up, favoring his good leg. He walked across the short distance of the room, stopping inches from her. He reached out. His calloused hand bypassed the bruised collarbone, tracing the heavy, soft swell of her hip. It wasn't a desperate, clinging touch. It was deliberate, grounding, a silent claiming of the space she occupied. "You're a stubborn woman, Clara." He murmured, his voice a low rumble in the quiet cabin. "I had to be," she answered, her voice trembling, just slightly, not from fear but from the sudden overwhelming heat in his eyes. Boone leaned down, his mouth brushing the skin of her neck, right where he had rested his weight on the trail. "Stay stubborn." There were no flowery promises in the dark. There was only the solid, heavy truth of his hands on her skin, and the quiet, undeniable realization that she had climbed the mountain begging for scraps and had conquered it as its queen. Survival isn't pretty, and love born from the ice is rarely soft. Clara and Boone didn't find a fairy tale. They built a fortress with their bare hands, blood, and sheer will. Their story proves that true strength isn't about fitting a mold, it's about refusing to break when the world tries to freeze you out. If this gritty, unvarnished romance resonated with you, hit that like button and share it with someone who appreciates real, grounded storytelling. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our next wilderness drama. Drop a comment below, sharing your favorite moment from Clara's journey.